3 gunshots echoed through the airport as a black woman collapsed only to rise again and reveal she was Judge Naomi Whitfield. The officers who pulled the trigger thought they held the power, but minutes later she walked into court determined to end their careers. How does a wounded judge turn her pain into the very weapon that brings justice crashing down on those who tried to silence her? If this injustice grips you like in Share, let's step into the story together. I was standing 2 people back in the security line at Charlotte that morning, the kind of morning airports are built for fast footsteps, coffee lids, rolling wheels, and a calm voice on the PA asking people not to leave bags unattended. Nothing special, nothing memorable. Just the steady hum of travel and the soft clatter of trays sliding into the X-ray. Then I saw him, Officer Mark Hannigan. Big frame, square jaw, the kind of posture that announces itself before he says a word. He stood near the metal detector like a statue that could bark. His eyes were busy moving left, right, left, skimming faces as if threat might grow out of a crowd like weeds. And then his gaze settled on her. She was small compared to him. A black woman in a gray hoodie, hands tucked close, a thin shoulder bag, held like you hold something that matters, but you don't want anyone to notice. She didn't rush. She didn't fidget. She stepped onto the footprints, lifted her arms, and waited for the machine to do its little spin. The detector chirped. Not an alarm that shouts, just a single sharp note. Bip. I've set one off with a belt buckle before. People do. You step back. You try again. It's a routine, not a crisis. Mark didn't treat it like routine. He moved fast, too fast for a small sound like that. Step aside now. He snapped the kind of command that doesn't ask for your cooperation. It snatches it from you. Heads turned. A toddler in a dinosaur hoodie stopped laughing. The woman in gray didn't argue. She shifted 2 steps calm as a person who has nothing to hide. She held up her boarding pass paper, creased ordinary. It's right here, she said. Her voice was even. Tired, maybe, not defiant. What happened next did not feel like time moving forward. It felt like time slipping its leash. Mark's hand went to his holster. Not drifting there. Striking. A decision already decided. He drew shoulders locked, stance wide, like he had practiced this in an empty room, and the room had taught him to be afraid. The woman's eyes widened, not in panic, more in disbelief, like the moment when a joke reveals itself as a threat. I wish I could say, someone shouted. Don't I wish I could say the world gave him a second to rethink? It didn't. 3 cracks split the terminal, clean, hard metallic. The sound bounced off glass and tile and rib cages. The first shot punched a spark off the metal post by the lane divider. The second shaved cloth from her sleeve, a neat, ugly rip that bloomed red at the edge. The third drew a line of blood down her arm, thin at first, then heavier, like paint finding gravity. A suitcase tipped over behind me and someone cursed. A woman near the conveyor belt started sobbing. The dinosaur kid screamed. I didn't move. My body forgot how. In front of us, the woman staggered a half step. She didn't crumple. She didn't run. She brought her wounded arm close, palm open, as if she could hold the pain in place. For a beat, there was only the sound of dropped plastic bins and a far-off cart winding down the concourse. The TSA officers froze like a photograph no one had consented to take. 2 of them looked at Mark, not at the woman. His gun was still up. His hands shook so slightly you only saw it if you knew how to look. She lifted her head. There are voices that ask for permission and voices that don't remember how. Hers was the second kind. You just shot a federal judge. It wasn't a shout. It landed like a gavel. Everything changed in the air around us. Even the PA voice seemed to hold its breath. Mark blinked, one of those blinks that isn't about dust or light. It's about a story collapsing. He didn't lower the weapon right away. His mouth moved, but the words tripped over each other. She reached, he said, pointing at the hand that still held nothing but air and blood. She reached for her ticket. Someone behind the podium whispered, too soft to count as courage, but loud enough to count as truth. Body cams, the woman said, still steady, still bleeding. Preserve them, all of them. Checkpoint footage, witness names. Chain of custody starts now. Her eyes never left Mark's. It felt impossible and absolutely inevitable at the same time. A TSA supervisor hustled in tie, crooked breath, short authority rattling in his pocket like loose change. "What happened here?" he demanded. It sounded less like a question and more like an order to produce a version of reality that wouldn't cost him his job. "She was non-compliant," Mark said, almost relieved to find a phrase that fit inside a report. "I gave a lawful command. She reached. She reached for a boarding pass," another agent said. She was young Latina, face pale but voice sure. "I saw it. I recorded it." Her hand hovered over her smartwatch like it might bite her. The supervisor shot her a look that said, "Think carefully about your future." She didn't flinch. Not much anyway. People were filming now. Not to be helpful, not to be cruel filming, because that's what you do when you don't trust the story that's being written over you. Two paramedics pushed through the security ropes bags swinging against their hips. "Ma'am," the taller one said, "we need to get you to a hospital." In a moment, the woman replied, "After you log every device and every name, you'll write it down before you touch me." There was no bravado in it, just procedure sharpened into will. The paramedics hesitated. "It's not every day you get medical orders from the person bleeding." "Do it," the supervisor snapped, trying to take charge, trying to paste authority over the hole in the morning where certainty used to be. The woman nodded once as if she had expected resistance and was relieved to find only compliance. She pressed her fingers to the wound, testing how much time she had. "Not much from where I stood. Enough from the way she moved. I kept thinking about the beep. That stupid single beep. How many times had I set one off? How many times had a belt buckle, a hair clip, a coin made a sound that meant nothing? It was the smallest note in the world, and somehow it had tuned a man to fear." An older man near me muttered, "Jesus." It wasn't a prayer exactly. More like an apology the moment didn't know what to do with. "Lower your weapon," the supervisor told Mark. His voice was a notch softer now, a warning dressed as instruction. Mark's eyes flicked to the phones pointed at him, then back to the woman. He holstered the gun, slowly, carefully, like he was returning a secret to a box that would never stay shut again. The woman straightened. She swayed and caught herself on the edge of the metal table where plastic bins slide toward the belt. "My name is Judge Naomi Whitfield," she said, not for Mark, not for the supervisor, not even for the cameras. "United States Court of Appeals, Fourth Circuit." If a room could gasp, the terminal did. Someone whispered, "She's a judge." Someone else said it louder, like the truth needed volume. He shot a judge. A teenage boy, skinny hoodie up, held his phone higher. He looked at her like you look at a lighthouse you didn't know was there until the storm hits. She saw him and nodded. "Keep filming," she told him. Not because the video would fix anything by itself, because light changes the color of a story. The supervisor tried to gather the scene into the shape of a briefing. "We will fully cooperate," he announced to the cluster of strangers who weren't a press corps but would do. This was an unfortunate. "This is a crime scene," Judge Whitfield said. "Call your director and your counsel. Call federal marshals. The chain starts here." Then, like an afterthought that was really a test, she added, "And get those children a quiet space." She gestured toward the dinosaur hoodie now hiccuping into his mother's sleeve. It was the first time anyone had spoken to the damage that wasn't on her arm. I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out, and the air tasted of penny and bleach. It didn't feel like a movie. Movies have music to make sense of things. This had only instructions and consequences. One of the paramedics started reading badge numbers out loud while the other wrote them down. The young agent Lena, her name tag said, stood a little closer to the judge, as if proximity could be another form of testimony. Mark stared at a point somewhere over our heads, as if there might be a door there he could step through to a version of himself that had made a different choice. The judge looked at her bleeding arm once, twice, then back at Mark. "We will do this by the book," she said. "My book, your book, the one the public paid for, and the one you swore to follow." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had already raised the stakes. There are moments you feel a line draw itself under your feet. On one side is everything you thought you knew about how mornings go. On the other is this. That's how part one ended for me, not with sirens or applause, but with a sentence that hung in the air like a verdict waiting for ink. You just shot a federal judge. And the quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that means the next chapter has already started, whether anyone is ready or not. I remember the exact moment the hush snapped. It wasn't a sound, not really. It was the shape of the air changing duty, taking the wheel from shock. Judge Naomi Whitfield pressed her palm to the blood on her arm, steadied her breath, and spoke like a person reading out the rules everyone had forgotten were written for this day. Preserve every camera, she said. Log every device. Take down every witness name. No edits, no gaps. Chain of custody begins now. She didn't bark. She didn't plead. She placed the words on the floor like evidence and dared anyone to step on them. Mark Hannigan was still holding the gun, not quite raised, not quite lowered, stuck in that no man's land where a man hopes the story will run backward. His mouth worked before his mind did. She reached into her pocket. I thought it was a weapon. The sentence came out stiff, like it had been ironed onto his tongue at a training he only half remembered. A beat of silence followed, the dangerous kind, the kind that invites a lie to take root. That's a lie, a voice cut and young, shaking, and brave enough to hear itself. We all turned. A TSA agent, Latina, mid-20s, maybe, stepped forward until her shoes touched the line where passengers are not supposed to go. Her name tag read Torres. She only took out her boarding pass. I recorded everything. She glanced at her smartwatch as if it might bite, then squared her shoulders as if she'd just decided who she wanted to be for the rest of her life. The supervisor, Kessler, shot her a look that said either not now or not ever. She didn't step back. Phones rose like a field of small flags. People started whispering into them, narrating what they saw to no one in particular and everyone at once. Is she really a judge? Did he just shoot a judge? The whispers braided into something thicker, heavier, doubt giving way to outrage in real time. Naomi didn't ride the wave. She made it. Medical, she said, turning her head just enough to catch the paramedics. You may begin only after you log devices and names. Write them down. Read them back. It wasn't cold. It was careful. She was bleeding, and she still built the table before she put the case on it. One paramedic hesitated, forehead knit, hand hovering over the trauma shears. The other started reading badge numbers and camera IDs out loud, and the young agent Lena repeated them, voice steadier with each digit. The supervisor tried to reassert himself, a man reaching for a hat the wind had rolled down the street. We'll handle this internally, he announced. Everyone calm down. We will conduct a complete. This is not internal, Naomi said without looking at him. This is public and federal. She flicked a glance toward the ceiling camera, then back to Mark. Holster your weapon. It wasn't a request. He slid the gun down, slow performative care, in every inch, like gentleness now could polish what violence had just gouged. His hands trembled. He caught me watching and looked away, eyes skittering to the reflective tile, to the phones, anywhere but the wound he'd drawn. A man behind me muttered, "She told you," not triumph, accounting. The PA system, oblivious to our new reality, chirped about unattended baggage. The message felt obscene. People shifted, creating a corridor of space around the judge, the way crowds do around fire, close enough to feel the heat, far enough not to lose eyebrows. Name, Naomi asked Lena. Torres. Lena Torres. Agent Torres, Naomi said, stand beside the paramedics. Your recording is now evidence. You will not surrender it except into a sealed chain. To the supervisor, you will not pressure her to do otherwise. It was the tone of a person who had been ignored before and was preemptively done with it. Kessler bristled. Judge, with respect, you are a passenger here? With respect, she answered, finally meeting his eyes. I am a witness, a victim, and an officer of the court. Those roles outrank whatever comfort you hope to recover this morning. The line hit him square. You could see it. He switched tactics. Officer Hannigan perceived a threat. Protocol authorizes, protocol does not authorize imagination, Naomi said. It authorizes observation. She looked to Lena. What did you see? Lena swallowed. She stepped through. The detector beeped once. You told her to step aside. She did. She reached for a paper ticket. She glanced at Mark. He fired. Did she raise her voice, resist move toward him? Naomi asked. No, Lena said. She looked surprised. Good, Naomi replied, like a teacher hearing the correct answer to a question you wish no one had to know. Note that. Exact words, the paramedic scribbled. Phones recorded. The air learned to write. A woman near the conveyor belt spoke up next. I saw it too, she said, voice thin but determined. She never moved fast. He did. Name, Naomi asked. Karen Price. She flinched, then added, the other kind of Karen. A ripple of laughter broke the tension for half a second, humanity asserting itself before the gravity reasserted. Names were added, angles were claimed. The moment hardened into record. Mark tried again, softer now, almost pleading with the moment to make room for him. It was a split second, he said. I had to decide. He wasn't talking to Naomi anymore. He was talking to the report he wanted to live inside, to the union rep who wasn't here yet, to the version of himself he could still defend if he said the magic words quickly enough. Naomi's face didn't change. Decisions have weight, she said. Yours just landed on my arm, on this child's ears. She nodded toward the boy in the dinosaur hoodie, hiccuping now, but listening, on everyone in this line. We will measure that weight. A siren wailed outside, distant, irrelevant. The terminal had its own emergency now. Ma'am, the paramedic said gently, we need to wrap this. He gestured toward the bandage, the saline, the tools that do their work without speeches. Begin, Naomi said, and keep writing. She sat finally on the edge of a plastic chair someone had dragged from a nearby gate. The paramedic cleaned the wound. She winced and didn't apologize for it. I realized my hands were shaking. I steadied them by holding my phone tighter. It felt small and heavy at the same time, like a right I hadn't earned but suddenly owed. More witnesses spoke. A baggage handler on break. A business traveler with a watch expensive enough to make the scanner sing by itself. A college kid with a cracked screen. Their details overlapped and diverged the way truth does when seen from different distances, but the spine of it didn't bend. One beep, one ticket, 3 shots. Kessler tried to herd the chaos back into a pen labeled procedure. Everyone please, he said, palms out. We'll take statements at the office. No, Naomi said. Statements get lost in offices. She nodded toward Lena's watch. Footage gets lost in offices. A couple of people snorted, not laughter, recognition. Mark's eyes flicked to the exit, then to the camera above it, then back to the floor. He looked like a man counting doors and finding only walls. Officer Hannigan, Naomi said, voice cool enough to steady the heat in the room. You will provide your body cam immediately into the chain. He touched his chest reflexively, then froze, a small theater of muscle that told its own story. The supervisor stepped in. We'll review, you'll preserve, Naomi corrected. It was a duel without raised voices. Paper versus posture, policy versus habit. And for the first time since the shots, I felt the room tilt toward one side. A man in a suit eased through the crowd, the airport's legal counsel, I guess, smelling like an office that had sprinted. He whispered to Kessler. Kessler's jaw flexed. Decisions were being made in the old way behind teeth. The new way was happening out loud. Is she really a judge? Someone asked again, softer now, like a person confirming a rumor they're afraid will be true. Yes, Naomi said, meeting their eyes one after another, like signing her name across their disbelief. I am, and what happened here will be answered there. She looked past the checkpoint, past the ticketed gate, past the day any of us thought we were having. But first we do this right. The silence that followed wasn't the stunned hush from before. It was the quiet of people choosing a side. Eyes shifted, shoulders set. The cameras didn't blink. Neither did she. And then, as if the room had been waiting for a cue, we didn't hear the murmurs, swelled, not chaotic, not cruel, simply the sound of a crowd deciding out loud, this is not going to be buried. That's how the silence tore. Not with a scream, but with a record. Not with panic, but with procedure held like a shield. And every look that landed on Mark after that carried the same unspoken verdict. We saw it. We will say it. We will remember it the way it happened. Robert Kessler came storming in like a man who believed volume could bend reality back into shape. His tie was crooked, his hair slicked the wrong way, his eyes already hunting for an explanation he could hand to the cameras. She disobeyed orders. He barked, pointing at the woman slumped against the column. She's non-compliant. That's all this is. But Naomi Whitfield didn't rise to meet his anger. She sat steady, her back against cold stone, her hoodie darkened with blood that spread in a slow bloom across the fabric. Her breathing was measured, not frantic. She asked a medic for a phone, and when it was placed in her hand, she dialed with the poise of someone reading a verdict. This is Judge Naomi Whitfield, she said into the receiver. Her voice carried through the stunned quiet. "I've just been shot. Federal presence needed immediately." The room stilled. You could feel it like everyone's lungs had forgotten what to do with air. A couple of people exchanged looks as if daring each other to ask, "Did she just say judge?" Even the PA system seemed to hesitate before crackling out its next announcement about baggage left unattended. Naomi lowered the phone, her hands steady though her arm trembled from blood loss. She scanned the faces around her, then spoke slowly so no one could mishear. "I am a federal judge of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals." It landed heavier than any gunshot. A murmur rippled across the crowd, swelling until it broke into open shouts. "They shot a judge." One man yelled, his voice cracking between disbelief and rage. A woman near me clasped her chest, shaking her head. A teenager lifted his phone higher, whispering, "It's true, oh my God, it's true." Mark Hannigan's face drained, his jaw tight, as if clenching could hold his career together. The color drained from his ears, leaving him looking both pale and furious. Kessler's mouth opened and closed, scrambling for another script. He gestured wildly at the paramedics, at the phones, at anything that wasn't Naomi. "She's confused, she's injured," he insisted, trying to smother the fire with excuses. But it was too late. The match had been struck. Naomi had named herself, and once a truth like that enters a room, it cannot be buried. I could feel the tide shift in the air around us. Witnesses who had been afraid to speak now murmured to each other with conviction. Passengers who had crouched behind suitcases now stepped out, phones raised like shields of accountability. Naomi leaned her head back against the column. Blood still ran down her sleeve, but her eyes were steady, fixed not on her wound, but on the man who had pulled the trigger. She had given the world her name, and that name had become a weapon sharper than any bullet. And in that instant, everyone in the terminal understood this wasn't just a shooting. This was the moment the system had turned its weapon on a judge. And no amount of denial from Robert Kessler could put that truth back in the dark. When people ask how Judge Naomi Whitfield stayed calm while blood soaked her sleeve in Charlotte, they imagine strength appeared in that instant. But her strength was born years before, on a summer porch in Atlanta when she was only 7. Her father, Leonard, had just returned from the recycling plant, boots caked with dust, shirt clinging to his shoulders. 2 officers pulled into the yard before he could set down his lunch pail. They said he hadn't paid a fine for jaywalking, a citation mailed to the wrong address. Neighbors peeked from porches as the cuffs closed around his wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice. But Naomi saw something deeper than iron that day, shame carving lines into her father's face. By the time he was released 6 days later, his job was gone. Inside, her mother, Patricia, was fighting her own battle. She had been a law student once, fiery and brilliant, close to finishing her degree. But 2 children to feed, no reliable car, and night shifts at a diner pressed harder than ambition could push back. The legal world that should have welcomed her refused to hire a black woman balancing lectures in survival. She dropped out before her 3rd year and settled into work as a paralegal forever, in the shadows of the courtroom she once dreamed of commanding. Patricia never let the bitterness show. Instead, she gave her daughter words that would become steel. "When you step into that courtroom, never wait for permission to speak." Naomi repeated it to herself until it became more than advice, it became law. Childhood was not kind. Naomi's shoes wore thin, and classmates laughed at her hand-me-down clothes. Teachers mistook her sharp questions for defiance. But brilliance will not stay quiet. At 15 in a civics class, she corrected her teacher's fumbling explanation of the Constitution. The room went silent. Whispers of know-it-all circled her desk, but she didn't flinch. She had already learned silence never saves you. She carried those lessons like stones in her pocket. Her father's arrest for nothing, her mother's dream deferred her own bruises from poverty and prejudice. They weighed her down, yes, but they also steadied her. Each one was proof that injustice wasn't an accident, it was a pattern, and patterns could be fought. So when bullets split the air decades later, when the 3rd carved blood across her arm, Naomi did not collapse into fear. She rose into memory. She remembered the porch, the neighbor's eyes, her mother's unfinished textbooks stacked in a corner. She remembered the humiliation of being doubted, the sting of being underestimated. And she remembered that promise, never wait for permission to speak. That past explained the woman who sat against the column in Charlotte, her voice firm while the world reeled. It explained why she placed justice above her own pain, why she ordered cameras preserved before paramedics touched her arm. Naomi Whitfield was not calm because she was fearless. She was calm because every wound before had trained her to bleed without breaking. And that is why in that airport she did not speak only for herself. She spoke for her father, for her mother, for every silence carved into her childhood. And it is why she has never stopped demanding justice, not as a privilege, but as a birthright denied too many for too long. I didn't learn Naomi's reason for flying that day until later, but the pieces were already there, scattered across the tiles like dropped coins. It explained the hoodie, it explained the paper ticket, it explained the look in her eyes that said she wasn't surprised by the shape of the fear pointed at her, only by how fast it fired. She wasn't traveling for work, no marshal escort, no court seal on a folder. She was flying the way the rest of us do when we are small inside a big machine, quiet, polite, forgettable. She wanted to disappear into the line and see what the line did to people like her. Weeks earlier, her nephew's 17 honors classes, the kind of kid who stores his future in a backpack, had been pulled out of a TSA queue in Richmond. Random, they said, the most predictable word in America. He stood there while a stranger, bored and impatient, tugged at the waistband of his jeans and tapped down his legs as if his bones were suspicious. When the boy flinched, a hand shoved harder. By the time he made his flight, one cheek had the purple memory of someone else's authority. I pictured Naomi listening to him tell it the careful pauses teenagers use when they don't want to scare the adults who love them. I pictured her thumb brushing the bruise like a blessing and a vow. Some people file complaints. Naomi buys a coach ticket. She designed the test like a lawyer builds a case. Control the variables, change only what the world insists on changing. Gray hoodie, no jewelry, wallet in the same pocket every time. A printout boarding pass that crinkles like a sin. Shoes easy to slip off. She didn't use her judicial ID. She didn't use TSA pre-check. She wanted what her nephew got, the ordinary gauntlet. At the first airport, the detector beeped. A woman agent smiled the way people do when they know what fairness should look like. "Step back for me, please." Naomi stepped. The wand skimmed. The woman nodded, waved her through, and said, "Have a safe flight." Naomi filed the tone of that voice under baseline. At the second airport, the agent was curt but careful. "Extra questions. Where are you heading?" "Purpose of travel," Naomi answered without flourish. He stared 2 beats longer than necessary, at her face, then at the hoodie, then at the line growing behind her. He sighed, nodded her on. She filed that under variance. Charlotte was the third airport. Third is where patterns show themselves. You can call it coincidence, only twice. I had heard of Officer Mark Hannigan before that morning, but only in the way you hear about a pothole by the on-ramp. You don't know its name until your tire remembers it. Baggage handlers talked. Gate agents avoided his lane when they could. He's strict, one said with a shrug that tried to look neutral and failed. Picks his battles, another muttered, and the word picks stretched long enough to say what the mouth didn't. Naomi stepped into his frame like a line crossing a lens. Hoodie, paper ticket, calm. And you could feel the part of him that had been waiting not for her exactly, but for the chance to confirm the world he'd been trained to see. People keep asking me if the shooting was a mistake, a misread, a terrible second of bad judgment. Maybe that's a comfort, believing you can file a gunshot under accident and move on. But what I watched didn't look like a mistake. It looked like gravity, like the inevitable end of a long slope built by smaller choices, who gets questioned, who gets waved through, whose calm is called defiance, whose nervousness is forgiven as first-time flyer. Naomi knew that slope. She wasn't there to provoke it. She was there to measure it. That's what the hoodie was for. That's what the paper ticket was for. That's why she left the badge in a drawer and her status on the table. She wanted the unvarnished version of the system, not the polished one that appears when power shows a credential. And Charlotte gave it to her. Not a question, not a wand, a gun. After the shots, while the paramedics and the phones and the supervisor tried to stuff the morning back into an explanation, Naomi kept building her record. Preserve the cameras, log the names, read them back. It wasn't coldness, it was discipline. The same discipline you use when you know the world will try to forget your version if you don't write it down in ink. Later, when word traveled the way truth does, first on whispers, then on screens, People asked if she had planned to reveal herself no matter what. I don't think so. Watching her that morning, I believe she would have flown unnoticed if the machine had let her. She would have filed her notes where judges keep their quiet data on how justice breathes outside the courtroom. She would have gone to her emergency hearing with one more piece of evidence that the rules on paper are not the rules at the checkpoint. But Mark forced the reveal. And when he did, the purpose of her flight shifted not in direction, but in scale. This wasn't a private audit anymore. It was a public case. The defendant wasn't a man. It was muscle memory in a uniform. The tension in the terminal wasn't just fear. It was recognition, the sense that a pattern had finally drawn itself thick enough to see. You could hear it in the way passengers talked to their phones. Not something happened, but this keeps happening. You could see it in Naomi's face, a woman who had tested the water and found the current exactly where she expected it to be and stronger. That's why the morning felt both shocking and unsurprising. Shocking because gunfire never belongs next to a bin of plastic trays. Unsurprising because the slope had been there all along waiting for weight. The hoodie wasn't a provocation, it was a mirror. And the mirror did what mirrors do, it showed us to our discomfort ourselves. When Naomi finally said you just shot a federal judge, it wasn't a boast. It was a diagnosis. It made the injustice undeniable, not because a judge matters more than anyone else, but because if a judge can be reduced to a silhouette by a single beep and a single bias, what chance does a 17-year-old have with a bruise he didn't ask for? I didn't know her nephew's name then. I only knew that somewhere a kid who loved a backpack in a future was watching this unfold on a cracked screen. Learning again the lesson his aunt flew out to measure that justice to mean anything has to work, where no titles travel. So no, this wasn't a misfire in isolation. It was the end of a chain. Naomi had come to trace every link. Charlotte snapped it loud enough for the country to hear. And as she sat against that column, issuing orders through the pain, you could sense the purpose of the trip settling into something larger than a case file opening in the one courtroom where systems answer to the people they serve. I remember the look on Lena Torres's face as the chaos settled into something quieter, heavier. She had spoken up. She had pointed at the truth. And for that, the system turned on her. Within an hour, she was pulled into a side room, her supervisor's voice low, but sharp hand over the smartwatch Torres. "You're suspended pending review." Her fingers shook as she unclasped it. That little device was more than a gadget. It was proof, the kind that survives even when memory fades. She knew once it left her wrist, the truth might vanish with it. So before handing it over, she swiped, tapped, and sent the video file to her best friend with a single line, "Keep this safe." By the time Lena walked out stripped of her badge and her login credentials, the recording had already left the airport. It didn't take long for the clip to land in the inbox of Andre Cole, an independent journalist who had once been on the other side of the bars he wrote about. Andre knew injustice in his bones. Years earlier, a wrongful arrest had cost him 18 months of his life. Since then, he'd turned that wound into fire, exposing corruption with a precision that made both activists cheer and officials squirm. He opened the file on his laptop in a dim cafe, the kind of place where news is born in silence. At first, he leaned in casually, expecting shaky footage of an argument at security, but then the image sharpened. Naomi Whitfield standing perfectly still, a paper boarding pass between her fingers, blood already soaking through her sleeve. Across from her, a uniformed officer with a trembling gun. 3 flashes of light, 3 shots. Andre's hand froze over the keyboard. His lips parted as if the air had turned heavy. "They shot a judge," he whispered to no one, voice breaking on the words. And they didn't even know. The cafe around him carried on, unaware that a fuse had just been lit. Within minutes, Andre uploaded the clip to his secure server, the caption simple and devastating. She followed every command. He pulled the trigger anyway. He added 2 hashtags, where she shot a judge and Charlotte cover-up. The internet did what the internet does when truth is undeniable, and raw, it caught fire. The clip was shared 1,000 times in the first 10 minutes, 50,000 by the first hour. Comment sections filled with outrage, disbelief, grief. One woman wrote, "If a federal judge isn't safe at security, none of us are." Another, "They didn't see a judge. They saw a hoodie. That's all they needed." By nightfall, the story had cracked the walls of social media and spilled into the evening news. CNN rolled the footage, back-to-back anchors, whispering the word unprecedented. MSNBC called it a crisis of trust. Even Fox, usually cautious to touch such stories, replayed the clip with a headline that asked, "What happens when authority fires on its own?" Inside the airport's legal offices, panic simmered. Memos were drafted, phone lines burned. Officials tried to frame it as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a split-second decision. But the video would not bend. It showed calmness, compliance, and then the roar of bullets. No script could cover that. I scrolled through feeds that night watching the fire spread. People in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, all holding their phones up to the same moment, the same red sleeve, the same words spoken in disbelief. "You just shot a federal judge." And it struck me the system had spent decades controlling the narrative, bearing complaints, editing footage, silencing witnesses. But here in one raw clip from a young woman's wrist, the story escaped. They tried to keep it quiet, but the truth had already gone viral. The system wasn't in control anymore, the people were. That was the night the silence broke for good. I still remember the feeling in the city that night, like a storm had broken, but no rain had come. The air was heavy, restless, waiting for something bigger. And then it came. Just hours after the shooting, Judge Naomi Whitfield invoked a rarely used authority buried deep in federal code, the right to convene an emergency court session when constitutional rights face immediate threat. It was midnight when the summons went out. By 1 a.m, the courthouse lights glowed like a beacon. The chamber was packed beyond reason. Reporters spilled into the aisles, cameras balanced on shoulders, the buzz of whispered questions slicing through the silence. Along the front row sat stiff-backed officials from the TSA, their ties tugged too tight, their eyes darting toward the exits, as if escape routes mattered more than answers. Lawyers from the airport authority shuffled papers. They hadn't read their pens, clicking like nervous ticks. Then the doors opened. And there she was. Naomi Whitfield stepped into the room, her black judicial robe falling heavy across her frame. A white bandage wrapped her left arm, peeking through the sleeve, where blood had earlier soaked through. She moved with a calm that wasn't fragile. It was carved, deliberate, the kind that told everyone she hadn't come to survive this night. She'd come to define it. The murmur in the gallery died. The clerk's voice cracked as he called the session to order, but the sound hardly mattered. All eyes were already locked on Naomi. She took her seat at the bench, lifted her chin, and nodded once. It was enough to settle the storm. "Play the video," she ordered. The lights dimmed. On the massive screen at the front of the courtroom, the footage flickered to life. There she was, Naomi, standing in the airport line, ticket in hand posture, calm voice even. The beep of the scanner, the barked command from Officer Hannigan, her slow movement toward her pocket, and then the gun. 3 bursts of light, 3 explosions of sound, her body jerking once, twice, the blood marking her sleeve. The silence afterward was worse than the gunfire. Every person in that room felt the weight of what they had just seen. It wasn't rumor anymore. It wasn't a headline or a hashtag. It was truth, undeniable and raw, playing on loop where justice was supposed to live. Naomi's eyes never left the screen. When it went dark, she leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the man who had pulled the trigger. Mark Hannigan sat stiff, his face pale, his jaw tight. He tried not to flinch beneath her stare, but her voice pinned him in place. "He didn't just shoot me," she said, each word steady enough to carry without force. "He shot justice itself." The room seemed to freeze on that sentence. Even the cameras hesitated, as if the air itself had been commanded into silence. Reporters lowered their pens. TSA officials shifted in their seats, and somewhere in the back row, a man whispered, "My God." I've sat in courtrooms before. I've watched trials and hearings, arguments and rulings. But that night was different. It wasn't law as we usually know it, slow procedural wrapped in motions and objections. It was law at its rawest, stripped bare, standing in the open with blood still on its sleeve. Everyone in that chamber knew they were watching more than a case. They were watching a system called to account in real time. And for the first time since those 3 bullets shattered the airport's quiet, the question wasn't whether justice would arrive. It was whether anyone in power could withstand it. That was the first true climax. The first time silence bowed its head to truth. And the room full of people who had come for spectacle or survival suddenly realized they were witnessing something much greater. A fight where the gavel carried more weight than the gun. I remember the way Robert Kessler rose from his seat, voice sharpened like a blade dulled by panic. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke as if authority alone could flip the story. Judge Whitfield interfered with a federal security process. He declared the words echoing too loudly in the chamber. We will be pressing charges. The gallery stirred gasps rippling through the benches. It was a desperate move, a pivot from defense to attack. Kessler's eyes darted across the room, searching for nods for approval, for anything that might shield him from the tide he knew was rising. Naomi leaned forward on the bench, her injured arm resting gently on the table, her gaze locked on him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You want to criminalize a survivor, she said slowly to protect the shooter. Her words dropped like iron into the silence. The question wasn't rhetorical, it was a verdict delivered in real time. Kessler flinched but pushed back papers, shuffling in his hands as though the noise could drown out her truth. Yet before he could continue, the clerk called the next witness, Lena Torres. The young TSA agent walked forward, shoulders stiff, but I could see her hands trembling as she placed them on the stand. Her eyes flicked to Naomi, then to the crowd before she began. She spoke of the threats that had shadowed her since the video surfaced. How men in unmarked cars had parked outside her apartment for nights in a row. How a letter with no return address warned her that loyalty is safer than truth. Her voice cracked when she mentioned her mother's phone being tapped. Her little brother followed home from school. The room shifted, anger mixing with dread. This wasn't just a courtroom battle anymore. It was intimidation bleeding into the lives of those who dared to speak. And then Andre Cole took the stand. The journalist's usual fire was dimmed by fatigue, but his resolve burned through. He told the court about the anonymous messages that filled his inbox, demands to take the video down, warnings that he'd vanished like others before. He even played one recording aloud, a distorted voice promising he'd regret crossing the shield. The sound sent a chill through the chamber. Some clutched their phones tighter, others glanced toward the exits. It wasn't just about a shooting anymore. It was about a system that had decided its own survival was worth more than the truth. The tension coiled tighter, every word adding weight. I could feel it in the way the spectators leaned forward in the silence, between Naomi's questions, in the fear that spread like smoke, but also in the courage that rose against it. By the end of that session, no one in the room believed this was the failure of a single man. It was something deeper, whiter, darker. A system reflexively striking back to protect itself. And in that moment, we all understood this wasn't just Naomi's fight. It was everyone's who had ever been silenced by power, pretending to be order. I got into the Rayburn building before sunrise, the kind of gray morning that makes marble look colder than stone. The line to enter the hearing stretched around the block, teachers, with canvas totes, veterans in caps, heavy with pins, students clutching notepads, mothers holding coffee in both hands like it was armor. By the time I cleared security and found a seat near the back, the hearing room buzzed like a hive trying to keep still. When Judge Naomi Whitfield walked in, the room didn't applaud. It exhaled. She wore a black blazer instead of her robe, a narrow bandage still peeking from beneath the cuff. She carried a leather case in the crook of her arm, as if it held something more fragile than evidence, something borrowed from the people who sent her there. The chairwoman called the hearing to order. Cameras blinked red. Staffers perched along the walls, fingers hovering above keyboards. Naomi adjusted the microphone not to amplify herself, but to make sure none of the words would escape. She began with no preface, no theater. I appear today not to discuss my injury, she said, voice steady enough to carry without strain, but to introduce the public record that has existed without an audience for too long. She opened the case and drew out a bundle of letters tied with thin twine. 14. Each one dog-eared, some folded and refolded, some written in cramped script, some typed and printed on cheap paper. She set them on the table like a stack of small verdicts. These are statements from travelers who experienced discriminatory treatment at airport security in the last 5 years, she said. They are not mine. They are ours. The clerk took the first letter. Naomi nodded for her to read. My name is DT. I'm 17, the clerk began, voice wobbling once, and then finding its footing. I was pulled from the boarding line on a school trip. They told me to stand with my arms out while my friends watched. A pause, thin as paper. They said I looked nervous. I was. It was my first time flying. The letter mentioned the laughter that trickled through the line, the coach who looked away the way the boy learned to keep his eyes on the floor so no one could see they were wet. I didn't tell my mom the letter ended. I told her I had a great time. You could feel the room lean toward the table as if sound had weight, and we were all trying to hold it up. Naomi slid the second letter forward. From JM Retired Army, the clerk announced. The handwriting on this one sloped like a man taught to fit his story into small boxes. Agent asked for my military ID, then asked for another, then asked why my name didn't match my face. I served 3 tours. There was a line that caught in my throat. He didn't say I wasn't a soldier. He said I didn't look like one. The letter ended with a single sentence that sounded like boots on concrete. I fought for a country that suspects me at the gate. The members on the dais looked down, some with their hands steepled, others expressionless in a way only cameras can teach. A few leaned forward as if proximity could make courage contagious. Then came the turn everyone was waiting for, the theater that hearings deliver like clockwork. A congressman from Oklahoma, a man whose lapel pin seemed to anchor his posture, clicked his microphone on. His smile was practiced, his tone a careful blend of etiquette and edge. Judge Whitfield, he said with respect, it appears you've turned your personal misfortune into a political crusade. Are we to rewrite national protocol every time an individual has a bad experience? Some people in the gallery shifted, prepared to groan or clap or leave. Naomi didn't give them the release. She looked at the congressman as if he were a puzzle with missing pieces. Then she answered the way she has answered since the bullets, without hurry, without heat. I'm not here because I was shot, she said. I'm here because many others never survived to tell their stories. The sentence landed with the soft force of a falling gavel. Not loud, final. Silence pooled in the room, not a vacuum, but a presence. You could hear the HVAC hum, the scratch of a pen, the faint whir of a camera, refocusing. Even the congressman's practiced smile hesitated, as if looking for a new script that hadn't been written. Naomi didn't build on the line. She didn't need to. She continued, letter by letter. Not all of them read aloud, some summarized, some entered directly into the record. The mother traveling with an autistic son who was made to empty his bag twice. The Sikh man told to remove his religious article and then told to remove his pride. The graduate student whose accent earned him a second screening and then a third each time with the same shrug and the same phrase, random. Each story wasn't a firework by itself. Together they were a constellation you could finally see. The chairwoman asked about structure. What reforms do you recommend, Judge? It was the kind of question that can sink into vagueness. Naomi wouldn't let it. External oversight of security complaints, she replied. Uniform data on who is stopped and why. Independent review boards empowered to audit, not just advise. A measurable standard for equity and consequences when the standard isn't met. She paused. No agency should investigate itself when the pattern of harm is the investigation. It wasn't a speech so much as a map. You could feel people in the gallery tracing it with their eyes. The congressman tried once more. What about officer safety, he pressed, leaning into a refuge that had shielded 1,000 hearings. Naomi nodded as if he'd asked the only fair question in the room. Safety is the point, she said, but safety is not a synonym for suspicion. When the definition expands to include one citizen's humiliation and another's wound, it stops being safety and starts being power. She let it breathe. Power must answer to the people who grant it. If there had been applause, it would have cheapened the moment. Instead, there was that same collective stillness I'd felt in the airport after the shots when people realized they had witnessed something that would not slip quietly back into routine. Staffers looked up from their keyboards. Even the cameras seemed to settle into a steadier frame. Outside the hearing room, hashtags weren't just trending. Phone trees were activating community groups, scheduling teach-ins, attorneys offering pro bono hours, airport workers whispering that maybe it was time to file the complaint they'd swallowed for years. The fight had stepped out of one woman's sleeve and into a nation's bloodstream. When the chairwoman moved to enter all 14 letters into the congressional record, the clerk's voice didn't wobble this time. It rang like a small bell in a big room. Motion. Second. So ordered. As the gavel tapped, I realized the center of gravity had shifted. This was no longer the story of a judge bleeding on a tile floor. It was the story of a country deciding whether justice is a title or a practice. And in that room, in the hush that followed Naomi's final words, you could feel a movement take its first steady breath. I woke up the morning the email leaked subject line plain as a paper cup termination, effective immediately. Mark Hannigan's name sat there beside it, and by noon his badge didn't open doors anymore. His logins blinked to black. The system that had armed his fear now withdrew its protection with the same efficiency it once lent him. News anchors said accountability unions said process, and strangers online wrote eulogies for a career they never admired. He wasn't just a man out of a job. He had become a signpost. This is where the slope ends when no one changes course. But this story was never just about subtraction. It was about what gets built. Within weeks, Judge Naomi Whitfield announced the creation of the Independent Council for Oversight and Ethical Enforcement, a mouthful at first, then a rhythm, then a destination. It wasn't a blue ribbon panel designed to fade with the headlines. It had subpoena power, transparent dashboards, a mandate to audit complaints and publish outcomes the public could read without a law degree. And on the day they introduced the first cohort of staff, Naomi turned toward a familiar face. Agent Torres, she said, smiling like relief, had finally found a seat, will serve as senior advisor for ethical enforcement practices. Lena stepped to the podium in a simple dark suit, hands steady now. She talked about training modules that measured equity, not just throughput, about protocols that treated hesitation as a moment for clarity, not a license for force. Her voice didn't tremble. If you listened closely, you could hear a young woman's heartbeat settling into the cadence of policy. Meanwhile, Andre Cole wrote in the hours the city slept. He stitched together transcripts, interviews, quiet testimonies from baggage handlers and night shift screeners, mothers and veterans, students and elders. When his book hit shelves, The Woman They Shot, The System, she judged it didn't read like a victory lap. It read like a field manual for people who refused to forget. Book clubs gathered around dog-eared chapters. Podcasts quoted passages about patterns and power. High school teachers assigned the airport scene the way civics once assigned Brown vs. Board. Andre didn't become famous. He became useful, which is rarer. At a small press briefing, no flags flanking the stage, no dramatic music, Naomi looked out at a room full of junior judges, clerks, and a few reporters, who still bring notebooks to fights. Her left sleeve hid a scar the cameras could not frame. "Justice is not the chair I sit on," she said. "It's the fight I choose every single day." It wasn't a slogan. It was a schedule. The reforms didn't fix everything. They never do. But complaints started to move faster than excuses. Data turned on lights in places that preferred dimness. Airports piloted training designed by people who had once been treated like suspects for the crime of existing. There were setbacks and headlines and nights when old habits clawed back ground. But the door that had always been locked was now ajar, and the hinge had a name. Months later, I saw her again, where the story first broke open at the airport. No robe, no entourage, just a woman with a carry-on and a boarding pass tucked inside a worn leather wallet. The morning felt ordinary in the way mornings do when you forget what they're capable of: coffee, lids rolling suitcases, the soft clatter of bins finding their track. "Ma'am, please place your bag on the belt," the agent said. He glanced up, recognition flickering across his face, then smoothing into something quieter respect that didn't ask for a scene. He handed the tray back, met her eyes, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." Naomi smiled. Not the public smile, not the courtroom steel. The other one, the private one you save for moments that return what the world once took. "Just Naomi," she answered, voice low enough to belong to the two of them and anyone near enough to learn. She walked through the scanner, no siren, no drawn guns, no chorus of explanations ready to declare her a problem. Just a woman traveling and a system doing its job without borrowing fear to finish it. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching the line breathe. A teenager fiddled with a backpack strap. An older couple argued gently about a gate number and then laughed at themselves. The agent waved another family through and bent down to help a child lift a bin that was heavier than his hope. It wasn't a movie ending. It was better. It was ordinary made possible by people who refused to accept that ordinary was out of reach. When I finally turned to go, I thought about titles: judge, officer, supervisor, passenger, and how thin they looked next to actions. Naomi's title had once made people assume safety. Her actions made safety real, even where titles have never mattered. That's the point I carried with me, past the vending machines, past the glowing departures board, into a day that would ask for more from all of us than watching justice doesn't need a stage. It needs repetition. And as the doors slid open to the morning, I realized the ending we'd been waiting for had already begun quietly, stubbornly, in the small ways systems learn to listen. Not with a gavel, not with a gun, with a practice repeated until it becomes a promise. If this story stayed with you, let it do more than end here. Judge Naomi's journey reminds us that justice isn't a title. It's a daily practice. That courage can be quiet and still change the room. And that ordinary people holding a camera or telling the truth can move a system. If you found value in this, please like the video and share it with someone who needs a reason to believe in accountability. And if you'd like more true, meaningful narratives, subscribe to Mr. Max Stories. Your support helps our team keep crafting thoughtful, high-quality stories that matter. We read every comment. Tell us what part hit home for you or what story you want us to explore next. Your voice helps guide what we make. Channel signature, Mr. Max Stories, stand tall, speak true.